CTNH aims to conduct research and disseminate scientific findings to enhance evidence-based practice for the betterment of our patients and also public health, especially in the areas of diet and lifestyle for non-communicable diseases. Today, we are very happy to collaborate with the Malaysian Endocrine and Metabolic Society and the Malaysian Dietitians Association to bring to you a lineup of eminent speakers to discuss in depth about the importance of diet and the role of glycemic index in diabetes management. The agenda this afternoon will kick off with Professor S.P. Chan to update us on the status of diabetes in Malaysia and her perspectives on the challenges faced with the rising prevalence and the importance of diet and lifestyle. Then after that, Professor Anthony Leeds will define glycemic index further and revisit the history of this fantastic concept of ranking carbohydrates food by their impact on blood glucose. And Prof. Anthony will be interviewing the father of glycemic index, if you like, Professor David Jenkins from the University of Toronto in Canada. We will then have Dr. Sangeeta and Dr. Lee Ching Lee from IMU to discuss the practical applications of glycemic index in the local context. I hope you're as excited as I am in listening to these eminent speakers. Some housekeeping rules before we begin. We have muted all the microphones and you may pose your questions on the Q&A chat box in the Zoom platform at the end, anytime while the speaker is speaking, and we will have a discussion at the end to take your questions. Okay, let's get on with the show. I now have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker. She's none other than my supervisor and the guru to everyone in diabetes, which is Professor S.P. Chan. Prof. Chan is a consultant endocrinologist and currently holding an honorary professorship at the Department of Medicine in University of Malaya Medical Center here in Kuala Lumpur. And she also practices at Subang Jaya Medical Center in Selangor. Now, I think we all know Prof. Chan very well, and some of you here may be, her senior consultant and professors who were her students then, myself included. And Prof. Chan as an academics have actually been very well known in the area of diabetes, endocrinology, and osteoporosis. Of course, Prof. Chan has been involved in many research. She's published so many papers. She's a member and chairperson of various task forces, both locally as well as in the region. And currently, Professor S.P. Chan is the chairperson of the 2020 Malaysian CPG Guideline for the Management of Type 2 Diabetes, which I have the pleasure of working with her on that. And also, she's now currently the president of the Malaysian Endocrine and Metabolic Society. Professor Chan, over to you to tell us about the challenges of diabetes in Malaysia. Over to you, Prof. Chan.
Thank you very much, Winnie. It's indeed a pleasure to be talking to everyone, and I'm very heartened to see that there are about close to 150 of you who have tuned in. So today the main topic of discussion is going to be revolving around how the impact of diet and improving body weight can improve diabetes. So my role is to kind of like set the scene for why I feel that the dietitians and nutrition is essential to the success of handling a person with diabetes. So in order to do that, I thought it would be appropriate for us to understand the burden of disease in Malaysia. And I think those of you who are tuning in this afternoon must know, unfortunately, Malaysia is a champion where the number of people with diabetes is concerned in this population. What about the challenges of diet and lifestyle? You will be hearing a lot more in-depth talk about this after what I've gone through. And then perhaps to round off what we believe in the holistic management of people with diabetes is the ABC, but not only just the ABC, D, E, F, G, and H. And then the fact that it is really a multidisciplinary approach that will get a successful outcome for our patients. So setting the scene in terms of the burden, all of you have seen this, all of you, right? Unfortunately, diabetes is prevalent to about 18% of adults above the age of 18. And this is from the National Health and Morbidity Survey that was run almost 3 years ago. The orange column belongs to those people who are known to be diabetic, And then about 50% of them were not diagnosed, but were considered as hyperglycemic according to a glucometer that was run off more than 7 millimoles. So if you think about it, what is 18% in our population? It is roughly 1 in every 5 adults in Malaysia have diabetes, and it is unfortunately a very large number. If you were to think to yourself, how do we compare? In first of all, in terms of men and women, are the different gender afflicted differently? The answer is absolutely not. You can see on the left here, the men are roughly about the same as women. In terms of overall, it's about 18%. How do we compare to the other countries in the region? And here you will see Western Pacific is almost 10%. Singapore is actually not doing very well. So unfortunately, we are tight, very close together, can't run away from the genetic past that we share. So they have, in fact, 14%. Okay, so you can see, unfortunately, diabetes is very prevalent. We are champions. Why is it? Why is it that we are getting such a large burden of disease? And probably this is one of the main factors. And I think, again, the appropriate discussion after my talk in terms of weight reduction in individuals with diabetes or chances of becoming diabetic. So in the blue columns are the overweight people, in the orange are the obese by BMI of 30 and more. Overweight is 25 to 29.9. And if you add the two together, it's like 66%. 66% of the known diabetic individuals in the NHMS are either overweight or obese. If you use the waist circumference of 80 and 90, and you will see that 3/4 of the people have android obesity. If you thought to yourself, hey, I'm young or whatever, what is the impact of increasing age on the prevalence of diabetes? And I would just like to highlight for you, okay? I'm trying to remove this little column, but I can't remove it, so sorry. So this is 40 to 50. About 20%, meaning 1 in every 5 individuals from 40 to 50 will be diabetic. And moving along, oopsie, trying to change my slides. Okay, right. So 50 to 59 is about 30%. 1 in every 3 individuals in that age group have diabetes. And then in 60 to 70, 4 in every 10. So 2 in every 5. It's actually terrible, the number of people with diabetes. According to age, it increases. So then you think to yourself, yeah, okay, having diabetes, no big shakes. But we know that diabetes does not come alone. It comes with coexisting medical conditions that increase cardiovascular risk. So what do we notice in our patients with diabetes in Malaysia? 80%, 8 out of every 10 have hypertension. What else do we know? About 3/4 of them have hypercholesterolemia. And then, as I mentioned to you, in our NHMS was 75% android obesity, 66% overweight obese. But in those individuals who were followed up in the National Diabetes Registry in the Ministry of Health, 85% of them were obese or overweight. And the mean body mass index of our patients being followed up in the primary care in Ministry of Health is 28. So we're starting to see, in fact, individuals who are getting bigger and causing diabetes to be more prevalent. And then the last thing is, okay, if I have a person with diabetes, how well are we doing in terms of getting our patients to better glucose control so that they don't get the diabetic complications that we are terrified of? But you can see here, the mean A1C in the primary care setting is 7.9%. If you look at, if I want a patient to have an A1C below 6.5, which is the ideal target, 1 in every 3 are able to reach that target. That means 2 in every 3 never reach the target. So as Winnie promised you, you're going to have a whole stomach full of diet, but I think to set the scene of how a physician looks at lifestyle modification and diet, okay, I will see, just put it in big letters. Malaysians, seafood diet, all of us have seen this, heard that. We eat what we see, right? There are lots and lots of myths and misconceptions that daily we face when we talk to our patients, and they do all the wrong things. And then again, on top of that, you have these fashionable diets, things like keto diets that everybody is fighting with. And I think it is really appropriate that we should address these misunderstandings around that, because it impacts unfavorably on how patients manage their diabetes. And the fact that I'm talking to you via my laptop and I'm kind of like talking to myself is because of all these things. And I'm glad that we're coming out of it, but I like this DMCO that was coined by my colleague, Dr. Alex Tan, that you would have heard of, Diabetes Mellitus Control Order. And I tell you one thing that I learned from the COVID pandemic: diet is king. Okay, those of you in Malaysia will understand what cash is king is from, right? But this is diet is king. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the fact that during the first 3 to 6 months of the first MCO, put your minds back, not too long ago, 2020, all right? March through till about July, August, when we had the first MCO and everybody was terrified, could not go out, could not access food, could not go out and exercise. Everybody was talking about why it would be terrible for their health, why they would put on weight because they cannot go out to exercise. But uniformly, the patients that I was able to see, and I was sharing this with colleagues at the same time, and they had exactly the same experience. 80% of the patients got better control. Their A1Cs were at target. They lost weight. Not because they were exercising, they couldn't go out, right? Not because they were exercising in the house, they didn't know how to, right? They hadn't quite, how would I say, discovered Food Panda, Grab, where they could order food readily. And all they did was sit at home. They said, I was like a tikus. I go into the kitchen and I eat. But whatever they did, their sugars got better. And that taught me a lesson. Diet, diet, diet. Not so much anything else. So I think you guys, the field is yours after this. But of course, we have to recognize physical inactivity, and we have to recognize that, look, we are a lazy lot. Okay, this is again from the National Health and Morbidity Survey. I have to thank Dr. Subhash for sharing this with me. And about a quarter of the population don't exercise. And you can see in the pink for women, the women are even more lazy than the guys. And if you look at age, you can recognize again the ones, the younger age groups tend to be less of them are physically inactive. The older age groups are more physically inactive, and they need to be doing more exercises. And again, if you look at locality and who are the ones who are the most inactive, you can see that the urban ones are more inactive, right? And the bottom and middle income are more inactive than the top 20%. Okay. However, I must say that if you look at the trends, physical inactivity seems to be better. Earlier on, 2011, more people were inactive compared to current. Okay. Having said that, okay, let's now move back to, as I said, we need to look at our patients in a holistic manner, not just A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and H. So what does that mean? This is from the CPG, the Clinical Practice Guidelines. And A, as all of you know, sugar control, A1C, very, very, very important. Blood pressure, cholesterol, all of us know this, okay? But what we need to recognize is D, E, F, G, H. D is for diet and drugs. E is for examination of the eye, foot screening, and the rest, okay? So please don't forget that the patient needs to have multiple avenues in which they are managed. So the challenges as we face it, Prof. Winnie, thank you for allowing me to share my insights. We have a big burden of disease. Our patients are also big. They are not active. They're not doing all the right things that we need them to do. Okay, and of course, understanding the importance of a multidisciplinary team in order to get our patients to where they need to be. The diabetes nurse educators, you guys, the dietitians, the pharmacists, all of us have a role to play. With that, thank you very much for your attention, guys. Back to you, Prof. Winnie. You are
okay,
muted.
thanks so much. Yes, thanks so much, Prof. Chan. And as usual, I knew that you would do a fantastic job just saying it as it is. And you're absolutely right. Even when we were recruiting during MCO for a study, we couldn't get anybody whose HbA1c was higher than 9% because suddenly they improved. Because as you said, no more eating out, no more going out, and yeah, you're right, diet is king, but in the positive way, not like the other
Absolutely.
one.
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay, so I think this is going to set a lot of discussion from here on. We've talked a lot about it on diet. We can further have in the forum to discuss again viewpoints about why is it that Malaysians, our prevalence continue to go up and we can't seem to be able to control our diet and our lifestyle. But Prof. Chan, you can now take a break and we will now move on to our next speaker. And he's none other than a very good friend of myself and to IMU and Professor Anthony Leeds. Professor Anthony Leeds is our visiting honorary adjunct professor at the School of Health Sciences in IMU. We've known Prof. Leeds for a long time. He was formerly from King's College, and then he got very active in his research about low energy diets and very low energy diets in weight management in clinical practice. He's currently works with colleagues at Parker Institute at Frederiksson Hospital in Copenhagen, where he's an honorary senior research fellow. He also holds honorary appointments in the University of Copenhagen, Denmark, and Glasgow in Scotland. I always say Dr. Leeds doesn't know how to retire. he has had several retirements. He currently he's the chairman of the TDMR Europe, which is an European industry group who works with the European Commission, EFSA, and also national agencies to optimize legislation and educate the public about obesity, comorbidities, and the role of diet in the management of diabetes, especially. So later, Prof. Leeds will also be interviewing Professor David Jenkins. Now, Professor David Jenkins actually, I think is very well known to some of us who work in the field of diet, and especially in glycemic index and dietary fiber and cardiovascular disease. Prof. Jenkins is the university professor in the Department of Nutritional Sciences and Medicine at the University of Toronto. He's almost 80 plus, Dr. Leeds, you were saying?
Probably almost, we should ask him, really.
Yeah, but he's still a very active academician and also researcher. Due to the time difference, Prof. Leeds cannot do a live session, but Dr. Leeds will be interviewing Prof. Leeds in his talk. So Professor Leeds will be taking over next to now let us delve deeper into the issue about glycemic index. We know that in Malaysia, we love our carbohydrates. Do they really matter? I know that in my earlier practices, where we do not have enough local data about glycemic index, we focus a lot about total carbohydrates rather than GI.
Thank you very much.
So from here on, let's hear from Dr. Leeds about GI and glycemic load, and do they really matter? Over to you, Dr. Leeds.
Thank you very much indeed. May I have the next slide, please? So what I'm going to do this morning is begin by introducing David Jenkins. Of course, you've heard a little about him, but we're going to refer back to the time when he was working within the Medical Research Council's gastroenterology unit in West London on a program looking at the effects of dietary fiber. And in a moment when I question him, you'll see that that actually was ultimately what led to the development of the definition of glycemic index. It's also important, though, to remember that David Jenkins also described the portfolio diet in 2003. And this was a description of a diet incorporating those food components which individually lowered cholesterol, but if you put them all together, they had quite an appreciable effect. And the portfolio diet has been used in a number of countries in Canada and the United Kingdom as an adjunct to drug therapy in hypercholesterolemia. May we move on to the next one, please? So what I'm going to do is start by looking at definitions. I'm going to look at the areas of application, and then I'm going to interview David Jenkins, and then we're going to make a few concluding comments. Next one, please. Glycemic index, as you all know, is a measure of the rate at which ingested carbohydrate causes the level of glucose in the blood to rise. It's a ratio, it has no units. Glycemic load, in contrast, is the glycemic index multiplied by the grams of carbohydrate, either in the portion or the meal or the diet, and therefore that has a unit of grams. And as you all know, the ranges that we conventionally use for glycemic index are up to 55 for low GI, medium is 55 to 69, and high is GI above 70. In the past, experimentally, different comparative foods have been used. Some work was done with white bread, but of course there's a lot of variation in the composition and structure of breads. So in fact, glucose is usually the reference food, although if you look at some of the international tables, you'll see values given for both options. Here, by way of example, is the typical curves that might be seen when these foods are tested on a panel of 12, maybe 15 or 20 participants. You will see that the area under the glucose curve following the baked potatoes is 85% of the area for that given by the glucose. This gives a GI of 85. In the bottom panel there, you see that for lentils and indeed for other legumes, you would see a much lower area under the curve, giving, in this case for lentils, a glycemic index of 29. Next slide, please. What are the food characteristics that influence glycemic index? Well, really important ones are starch gelatinization. The less gelatinized the starch in the food, the slower the digestion. Gelatinization is the process whereby water enters the starch granule. Gradually, the starch is hydrated and swells, and then leaves the granule and eventually becomes part of the general food matrix. Starch has different structures. It has either a single chain with no branches, or it can be a branched chain. The more amylose, the slower the digestion. So the actual composition of the starch is a critical variable. Physical entrapment within cells. There's been a fair amount of work on this over the last 20 or 30 years. The extent to which food is milled to make larger or smaller particles, and also, interestingly, the extent to which food is chewed. So the more chewing, the more breaking up of the cellular structure of plant foods, the more the content of the plant cells is able to escape. Viscosity of dietary fiber. Some foods, such as oats, legumes, some vegetables, provide viscous fiber, which has been shown experimentally to slow down the absorption of sugars from the gut lumen. And then various other food components that interact to alter, for example, the rate of gastric emptying, which then in turn affects the rate of digestion. Next slide, please. So top left there, you see an example of the way in which particle size alters the glycemic response. So fine wheat flour, coarse flour, cracked wheat used to make a bread or a meal, a porridge type meal, giving different glycemic indexes. And then the bottom left panel there, you see the general illustration of the way in which amylose, which is slowly digested, is a single chain, whereas amylopectin, which is more rapidly broken down by enzymes and digested, is a branched chain structure. Now, this is an interesting issue because, of course, the soft texture rice, which is consumed extensively, is in fact low amylase and is rapidly digested. It is possible to breed varieties of rice which have more amylose and therefore are more slowly digested, but of course that then changes the physical nature of the grain and also the way that it responds to cooking. In Australia, plant breeders have produced low GI brown rice, which has a GI of 54. This has 30% amylose, but of course it is a relatively hard rice after cooking. Next slide, please. I've also picked out this reference to draw to your attention because it has a very good analysis of all the characteristics of rice that determine glycemic index. This is a rather complex slide, but it actually incorporates all of the key features that need to be considered. So not in addition to the choice of cultivar and the proportion of amylose and amylopectin, we need to bear in mind that the amylose can form complexes with lipid, but also the processing after harvesting, the milling, the extent to whether it's cooked, the question of parboiling, which is partial boiling, in other words, partial change of the structure. But then it's also important to recognize that if you then cool rice and indeed other carbohydrate foods, the starch in effect almost recrystallizes to become tighter and less digestible. And so when you put all of those variables together, the response that you get at the end is determined by this complex interaction of all of these various factors. But the general principle, of course, would be to achieve lower postprandial glucose, would be choosing a high amylose content and also minimizing cooking times and perhaps also allowing cooling of the food before consumption. Next slide, please. So the applications are well known to all of you. The principal one being the use of glycemic index in control of blood glucose in diabetes. A great deal of work has been done on that over the last 40 years, and it's generally well established. But one of the questions that we'll be discussing today is, if it's generally well established, why isn't it as effectively introduced into the dietary regimens that we advise our patients about? There are probable reasons for that. And then also the question of the improvement of cardiometabolic risk factors, so the effects on blood lipids, body weight, blood pressure. Again, there's an extensive literature showing that to a degree, increasing glycemic index, lowering glycemic index and lowering glycemic load actually does change these variables in a beneficial way as far as dietary management is concerned. And this is particularly in people with type 2 diabetes, but also has an application in type 1 diabetes as well. And I draw your attention to a review that was published last year that is an important source of material for the revision of the European guidelines for diabetes management, which will be announced next month at the meeting of the Diet and Nutrition subgroup of the EASO. So now I move on to the interview with David Jenkins. And because of the time difference between Kuala Lumpur and Toronto, it was not possible to do this live. So I spoke to David a few weeks ago. So here is Professor David Jenkins. David, thank you very much indeed for joining us at this meeting. And I thought it would be good if we just explored one or two of the interesting questions that relate back to the initial development of glycemic index, which I think was first described fully in 1981. What ideas had preceded that? For example, what work had you done in relation to dietary fiber and various other characteristics of food that led to the glycemic index being defined in the way that you defined it?
Thank you, Tony. Well, as you remember well, Dennis Burkitt and Hugh Trowell were great influences on the lives of both of us. I think that it was a natural extension of the dietary fiber hypothesis. In other words, if one could reduce the rate of digestion and therefore reduce the rate of postprandial rises after meal eating, this would be a good idea.
But there are a number of characteristics of foods, aren't there, which actually affect the way that glucose responds to consumption.
Absolutely. I mean, dietary fiber is what? Dietary fiber of certain salts, and in a certain context is one of them. The way that the starch is put together, the starch-protein interaction is very important. These sort of things are important. Many other micronutrients and phenolics and these sort of things all limit the rate of digestion. There are a plethora of things, too many really to classify easily.
Yes, and when we come to the question of translating all of this into guidance for patients and for people, there are lots of varieties of different carbohydrate foods. So, for example, for rice, I think there may be as many as 600 or 800 different varieties, and the proportions of the different types of starch in them do vary. So we need to give guidance, don't we, on which types of varieties people should consume.
Well, I think that's right, and I think that's a very good point that you're making, because it's such a major food component for a large portion of the world's population. We have to do this. We haven't done this effectively yet.
But the other aspect of this, of course, is also the glycemic load, where, as I've just described, glycemic index is multiplied by the amount of carbohydrate, and that if you then add up all the values, it gives you an indication of the glycemic load of the whole meal, and indeed the whole diet. And that relates, of course, to portion size and the portions of carbohydrate foods. What is your view on the size of carbohydrate portions that are regularly consumed throughout the world, although Western countries particularly?
It's difficult to say, and I don't know that it's a simple issue. I think that if you take carbohydrate on a North American diet and carbohydrate foods, you may or may not be doing yourself a service. You may be doing yourself a service if you're eating less beef and less eggs and less fatty foods in general. So you may be doing yourself a service. You may be doing yourself not a service if the glycemic index is high, if you've got highly refined foods, carbohydrate depleted of other natural nutrients, fiber, etc., in a refined form, you may be doing yourself a disservice. And I think that's clearly shown in North America, probably applies globally. So it depends what you replace the carbohydrate portion with. So when you say, what is the ideal carbohydrate portion?
Yeah.
I'm not going to make a judgment on that because it depends what you are going to replace it with.
Yes, yes. When we then consider different types of foods, I know that you've had a particular interest in legumes. I was working with you in the mid-1970s when we started to look at legume fiber, and we also explored the use of extracted fiber from legumes. And I recall those experiments where we consumed very large amounts of extracted fiber. Obviously, suppressed blood glucose rises very greatly. But I know that from a point of view of eating whole, intact legumes, that you're particularly interested, and that you would like to see people consume more of these foods.
Yes, I think I would. I think they're very useful because they're good protein foods. So they're useful for filling the protein gap, which is very important in those who are taking higher carbohydrate diets, and especially those who are taking more plant food diets, which is what we're advising the population to do anyway. So they're very useful in that respect. They have a starch-protein interaction, which seems to be very good in keeping the blood glucose under control. The fiber has an effect, and it has obviously in the sort of things that we were talking about, guar fiber and these sort of things are, which you, as you said, you tolerated for a while just for doing studies on, but maybe wouldn't be taking large amounts of just willingly. So, I mean, it was good as an example, but I'm saying that I think that the protein interaction with the starch in the legume is very important. It lowers the glycemic index and it provides a source of good protein. So I think that's useful. I do think, so yes, am I behind legumes? Yes. And do legumes have other effects? Yes. They have benefits and they have the other effect too for many people. Not interestingly so much on people who are habituated to these diets, because you acidify, it seems, the caloric contents and produce less gas and less problems. So people who are on high pulse eating diets don't necessarily have major problems.
Now, you've continued to work in this area since that original description, and been involved with writing of guidelines and so on. And dietitians across the world, of course, use much of the information that you generated in giving guidance to patients. Do you think that glycemic index is used as extensively as it should be, or is there much more to do?
I think that it can be used more than it is. It's used well, for example, in places like Australia, where Jenny Brown-Miller has done a tremendous job. And I think it's perhaps little used elsewhere, although it's given as dietary advice, but it's sort of... And so I think that possibly to start with, we should be focusing, as you're saying, on certain foods like legumes, to be honest, like fruit and vegetables, which also tend to be low glycemic index, and these can be promoted for their low glycemic index properties. I think the more detailed analysis can be useful, but it's obviously only one facet of the total dietary advice, but I still think it's probably a valuable facet.
Yes. Now, because you're involved with a number of groups and advisory groups, you're probably aware of things that are likely to develop over the next 5 years. What new information do you think we may have in a few years' time, and what are the likely trends in the way in which glycemic index may be understood, or are we going to see some new research outcomes that we're not aware of yet? Is there anything exciting coming up?
Well, I think there are things that are exciting coming up, and the fact is that more and more we're becoming aware of its implications for cardiovascular disease, and it puts the whole perspective on postprandial glycemia, insulinemia, and these sort of things as we've known as potentially modifiable risk factors of cardiovascular disease. So I think we'll see more data coming out in this area, and I think it will become not just for diabetes, but also for that great complication of diabetes, which is cardiovascular disease, which also affects the general population. So I think there will be use there. I think there will be other things that we're going to see. We're going to look at probably other aspects of gastrointestinal physiology. For example, postprandial effects on blood pressure. I mean, in the elderly, there are concerns that there's a thing called postprandial hypotension, which when people eat fairly large amounts of refined carbohydrate, because of the digestion required and the blood supply required to the gastrointestinal tract, you tend to steal blood from the systemic circulation, so your blood pressure falls. And some people suffer this badly, especially the elderly. And this may be another factor that contributes to stroke, cardiovascular disease. So we'll probably learn more about the mechanisms, I think, by which eating foods that cause big swings in blood glucose have harm. And obviously the antioxidants and the oxidative processes that are going on are important.
So I'm sure you're absolutely right, and we'll all look forward to seeing what happens over the next few years. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been a privilege to have you talk with us, and I'm sure that our delegates are sorry that the time differences between Toronto and Malaysia don't allow participation in a live event, but we're most grateful to you for pre-recording this talk with us. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you to everyone.
Questions was, is glycemic index used as extensively as it should be? And David mentioned the work of Jenny Brand-Miller in Australia, where in addition to undertaking experimental work, physiological studies, and also clinical trials, she's actually been a major advocate of the use of glycemic index, so that there is a research center, there's an endorsement process for foods that can actually receive a flash on the package to indicate that they are low GI. And also, of course, she's encouraged plant breeders and plant scientists and growers to produce lower glycemic index versions of carbohydrate foods. That includes rice, but also includes potatoes as well, where again, there are several hundred varieties of potatoes from which we can select appropriate types of foods. Other countries such as Canada and the United Kingdom also advocate the use of glycemic index, but perhaps not as strongly as is done in Australia. I've given you the web link to the site at the bottom of the page here. Next slide, please. In the guidelines, which were for Malaysia, which were produced in December, there is, of course, a recommendation to encourage the use of foods with low GI because of the prevalent problems, as you heard earlier, of lots of patients having much higher glucose levels than is desirable. This is difficult to achieve. We're going to hear more about that later on. And so it takes us then to the question of the practicalities of actually achieving this, but also the availability of foods. Next slide, please. And then I asked the question about portion sizes, and David responded to this by commenting, well, it would depend, of course, on what is replacing carbohydrate foods. And one of the problems in clinical practice, I certainly found this, and I know that colleagues in Malaysia have as well, is that patients describe very large carbohydrate food portions. And so we're actually thinking more not so much of the question of substitution of foods on an isocaloric diet, but actually trying to achieve an energy restricted diet to achieve some weight loss. And we're thinking therefore about reducing the total carbohydrate intake and the total glycemic load. Rice is the staple food in Southeast Asia. It's, as I commented earlier, it's difficult to produce a low glycemic index variety that retains its soft texture. However, breeders throughout the region, plant breeders throughout the region, have actually managed to produce medium GI varieties which actually do retain their soft texture. So some good progress is being made. Next slide, please. And then the question is, have we got any experimental evidence that it's possible to achieve glycemic index and glycemic load changes with consequent benefits? And one of the trials that is important is the preview study on people with prediabetes, which was undertaken in 8 countries. It's now largely fully reported. It began with just over 2,000 individuals following an 8-week total diet replacement formula diet of 810 calories per day for 8 weeks, losing on average 10.7 kilograms. That was the preparatory phase, and that was then followed by randomization to a 3-year weight maintenance program, within which there were interactions with the dietitian or research workers fairly frequently, but tapering off that frequency towards the end of the 3 years. And the diets that were applied were either a low GI, slightly higher protein diet, a slightly higher GI and lower protein diet. And then all of the 2 groups were also randomized in terms of high versus lower exercise levels. Now, there is full dietary data available for 1,279 individuals. And in a secondary analysis of the original study, which was primarily designed to look at the weight maintenance over the 3-year period, in the secondary analysis, the data was divided into tertiles of glycemic index and glycemic load, and you can see those values at the bottom of the screen. And you can see quite an appreciable difference between the average values for those. Next slide, please. And this is just one of the figures showing the effect of that carried out across the year, across the 3-year period. The bottom scale on both these panels is 8 to half a year, 26 weeks, 52 weeks, 104, and then 156 weeks, 3 years. And the vertical scale on the left is the changes in body weight. So remember, they lost just over 10 kilograms. So we're now looking at weight regain. And obviously, one of the challenges globally at the moment is not so much to achieve weight reduction, which is difficult in some cases, but relatively easy. It's actually maintaining weight after weight loss. So anything that we can do to facilitate weight maintenance is a good thing. And what you see here is there was a difference between the lowest glycemic index tertile of 45 and the highest one of 61. Small. It represented about 0.5 kilograms per year less weight regain, so 1.5 over the 3-year period. That's small, but we know that small changes are important over longer periods of time. And on the right-hand side, more importantly, you see the changes in HbA1c. Again, there was a reduction of HbA1c as a result of the initial weight loss, and then this was tracked over the 3 years. You see quite a difference here between the rise in HbA1c in the low glycemic index group and the rise in the higher glycemic index group. And that's very, very important, because this shows that this is the critical effect of following a low GI, low GL diet over the 3-year period in terms of maintaining the lower HbA1c. And actually, as a consequence here, the numbers of people who progressed to diabetes was reduced quite appreciably. Next slide, please. So I also asked the question, what progress will be made over the next 5 years? And David emphasized the greater understanding of the implications for cardiometabolic risk in people who don't have diabetes, but as we've heard, Southeast Asia, the rates for obesity and diabetes are very high and rising. So the proportion of people with cardiometabolic risk who don't have diabetes, I suppose, is a fraction, but nevertheless, we will learn more about this. With an aging population across all parts of the globe, we need to have more studies undertaken on older people. Much of the work is done, initial experimental work is usually done on younger adults and then middle-aged adults, but we don't have huge trials on elderly people, and perhaps we need to start doing more of those. There is, as I've mentioned, potential in the diabetes prevention program. So we might achieve weight loss by a variety of means, including formula diet, but then we need to maintain that weight change and the metabolic beneficial changes that have occurred. And one of the ways to achieve this may well be to use low GI, low GL diets. Now, also in terms of progress over the next 5 years, David didn't mention this, but actually I think there will be a great deal more work done on the development of food varieties with optimal or nearer to optimal characteristics, low GI hard rice in processed foods. Now, because of that problem I mentioned earlier, that low GI rice tends to be hard, it may be more appropriate to use it for processed foods such as noodles and snacks. And the soft textured low medium GI rice may be achieved not so much by changing the starch composition, but by manipulating the polyphenols. Plant breeders and plant growers throughout Southeast Asia are working on this, and I'm sure that in the next few years we're going to see a number of new varieties, although there are already some good varieties. I know some of the Australian Dugara rice, I think, is available in parts of Southeast Asia, but there are also some varieties from other rice research institutes around the region. which will become increasingly available, I'm sure. Next slide, please. So just as a reminder in relation to diabetes prevention, there is the experimental work, the randomized controlled trial in preview, but also this systematic review of prospective cohort studies, which was published in 2019 and will also contribute to the new guidelines to be produced next month. And I've drawn some lines over one of the figures in there. Glycemic index is along the bottom scale, and the risk of developing diabetes is in the scale. This is obviously a composite taken from vast numbers of cohort studies. And what you see here is that the higher the glycemic index in the diet overall, the greater the probability of that particular population moving towards diabetes. And so if we can take population average glycemic indexes down into the middle range, it would be better. But then if we can get them even lower, it would be even better. So that is something that needs to be thought about as part of diabetes prevention programs. Next slide, please. So to conclude, glycemic index and glycemic load do matter. They do make useful contributions to control of glucose and then to other important variables that are related to cardiometabolic risk, blood lipids, body weight, blood pressure, and indeed to inflammatory markers as well. And this is applicable to type 2 diabetes and also to type 1 diabetes. In the future, we're going to see more work on outside of the area of diabetes, specifically looking at cardiometabolic risk factors, although I have to say a great deal has already been done. For example, Gary Frost and Eleanor Philippou at Imperial College in London did a great deal of work on this about 15 or so years ago. So there is a good literature in these areas. And of course, because making GI and GL changes in diet is really a very safe thing to do, we really should go ahead and use this as well as we can, as soon as possible. And then just a note at the bottom there is a reminder that there is potential use in diabetes prevention, which is something which globally is required desperately, because although we talk about diabetes prevention, the proportion of the at-risk population that is receiving an intervention is very small indeed. So there's a great deal more to do. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Prof. Leeds, and also thank you for the interview with Professor David Jenkins. I think Professor Leeds has given us a nice overview on what has been the evidence currently on glycemic index and the use of glycemic load. I found very interesting looking into cardiovascular risk, which as dietitians, sometimes we may not think about it. You think more about diabetes and postprandial glucose only. So I'm sure we're going to have more discussion on that later. Okay, let's move on now. And I know that in the audience, we have a lot of dietitians as well as diabetes educators, or very practical people. And now we're going to move to the second part of the talk, where we'll now look at practicalities. So I have the pleasure now to introduce two speakers. I'll introduce Dr. Sangeeta first, and then later we have Dr. Li-Ching Li. So Dr. Sangeeta is actually my colleague and my friend in IMU. She's a senior lecturer at the Division of Nutrition and Dietetics here. She's also a fellow of IRDI, which is our Research Development and Innovation Institute. But what I'm really impressed is Dr. Sangeeta is actually a member of the FAO's high-level panel of experts for Project 17. Sounds so mysterious, right? It's on food security and nutrition data collection tools and analysis. And she's also been a supporting member of the Federation of European Nutrition Societies Working Group to improving standards in the science of nutrition. And I'm very proud to also inform you that in 2021-2022, she is the Interstellar Initiative participant, which is a program for the world's most promising early career investigators that's sponsored by the New York Academy of Sciences and the Japanese Agency for Medical Research and Development. So Dr. Sangeeta is going to talk to us about the use of what is the current research that she's done, a lot about glycemic index in the local context, and she'll be sharing that data. And then after that, we have Dr. Li-Ching Li, again, my very best friend, and also we work together very closely in IMU. Ching Li is the senior lecturer and also practicing dietitian at IMU. She's the program director of our PGDIP Diabetes Management and Education program. Ching Li is a very much sought after speaker. I think we've heard her a lot in a lot of diabetes conferences. And she's a very effective speaker. I know she provides very good dietary counseling at IMU Healthcare as well. And she's also a member of several professional organizations, including, besides MDA, of course, is for MDES, and I'm very proud to say that she's part of my colleague for the 2021, when we worked at the 2020 CPG, 2021 CPG for diabetes together with Prof. Chan. And also she's now a working group member of the Malaysian Credential Diabetes Educators Working Group. So we'll hear from Dr. Sangeeta, and then after that, we'll have a case study from Ching Lee, right, on how to apply glycemic index in the local context. So over to you, Dr. Sangeeta first, and after that, Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Prof. Winnie. So I have tried to share my slides. Hopefully you're able to see it. Are you able to see the slides? Can I see?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thank you so much, Prof. Winnie. That sounded like somebody else, but I was really happy to hear it from you. I thank all the organizers for giving me this opportunity, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, friends, and thank you for joining us here. In the next 15 minutes or so, this is what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try to talk to you about GI and why it is important in our Asian context. And I'm also going to show you some of the exciting work that we've done in IMU here with Malaysian population to show you the evidence that we have for GI in health and disease. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about some of the research we have done in terms of translating the science of GI into practice. So let me first move into talking about GI in the Asian context and what does the literature say. So here you go. We have this first slide, which comes from Professor Henry's research group in A-Star, very close to us from Singapore. On your left, you're seeing UK Caucasian people. And on the right side, you're trying to see Asian Indians. So what happens is when you feed the same amount of carbohydrate with around the same quality, so let's say 2 biscuits of the same brand, you feed it to both of them, the postprandial glycemic response in the Asian subjects is 2 to 3 times higher. And why does this happen? Because first of all, the peak, if you can see, is higher. And the duration that it takes for the blood glucose to reach the pre-feeding level is also higher. Therefore, their postprandial glycemic response is way higher in Asians. Secondly, so what happens when you replace a high GI food with a low GI food? All of them benefit, definitely. So there is a reduction in their postprandial glycemic response. But here's something I want to point out to all of you. Look at the benefit in the Caucasians versus the Asians. So the Asians seem to benefit more from swapping high GI with low GI foods. Dr. Ching Lee will be talking to you about how to actually put this into practice slightly later. So that becomes very intuitive for us, and we would think that low GI diets would help with prevention of diabetes and also with the management of diabetes. So we had our undergrad dietetic students who quickly reviewed the literature and showed us that T2DM risk prevention was definitely doing better in the Asian population when they were on low glycemic load diets. And also diets which were higher in terms of producing their postprandial glycemic response were also detrimental in terms of T2DM risks. So you would see very similar things here in terms of diabetes management as well. And Prof. Leeds alluded to it. It's very important to also look at the CVD risks, and low GL and low GI diets did well in terms of doing all this management for you. So even if you look at the slides, the evidence is limited. You would see very few countries in Asia represented, but what I want to bring to your notice is that it is very, very consistent. And probably this amount of consistency may not be seen in the other populations. So that brings us to the question, why is GI working so well in the Asian population? So here's something that most of us speak about it so much that it has almost become cliche for us to say it anymore. So even at the same BMI, the Asians carry much more body fat. That's why we are called toffees, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. And where do we carry this fat? It's in the central portion. So we have more central obesity. And all of us here in this audience are definitely aware that when you have more central obesity, you have more insulin resistance, which leads to poorer glucose tolerance. So that's us as Asians. So we come with these genes. And the other thing that we come with as Asians is our big carbohydrate portion sizes. So we come up with a high glycemic load. And because of this, and because of the propensity for carbohydrate intolerance, we have a very high postprandial glycemic rise. So what does that do? It puts a pressure on the pancreas to increase the amount of insulin it secretes. And the poor pancreas, when this happens over time, gives up, and this leads to beta cell failure. And that's when somebody develops the overt type 2 diabetes. Even when somebody is developing the diabetes, this increased postprandial glycemia and the hyperinsulinemia leads to increased insulin resistance, more ectopic fat deposition, and this whole cycle, this vicious cycles keeps happening, and therefore GI becomes very important for the Asian phenotype. So now I have provided some evidence for you as to why GI is useful in the Asian population. And I'm going to show you some evidence that comes from the Malaysian population in particular. And these were mostly studies that were done in IMU. The first one, this was done by another undergraduate nutrition student from IMU, a cross-sectional, very small study, and less than 100. These were Malaysian adults of Indian ethnicity. You look at their age, they are so young, 18 to 45, healthy, no diseases at all. So definitely you would expect their glycemic parameters, the cardiovascular parameters to be very, very good. And it was. But I would like to take your notice to all these graphs here. Just don't worry about the graphs. What we are trying to show here is on the x-axis, you have the glycemic index or the glycemic load. And on the y-axis, you're seeing total cholesterol or LDL cholesterol. And even in this very healthy group, you're looking at a positive association between, meaning higher the GI or higher the GL, higher was their total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. And mind you, these are very, very young, healthy individuals. Now, we have all been trained to say correlation is not causation. So where is the causation data, you should ask me. And here's a study that we did a decade ago now. And this is a long-term RCT, so it's about a year. I wouldn't say it's really long-term, potentially one of the long-term studies that we have in Asia, and this is towards prevention of diabetes in a very high risk group. This is women who had gestational diabetes mellitus. Usually they tend to have a higher risk for developing type 2 diabetes. So what did we do in these women is that we had a low GI intervention where we had nutrition education, which taught them also about how to lower their dietary GI along with conventional dietary recommendation. So one group received what you would call conventionally healthy dietary recommendation, where you teach them to reduce their fat, control their portion size, increase their fruits and vegetables, etc., etc. But in the other group, you also teach them how to lower GI. And then we looked at what happens in terms of the metabolic risk management. So what did we look at? So in terms of the outcomes, we looked at glucose homeostasis, we looked at CVD risk factors, we looked at body weight, composition. Overall, we looked at 57 different variables because we also wanted to look at the safety in terms of 1 year what happened. So in this study, which is a typical RCT, two-arm RCT, very simple, very small study, I would say. We spoke to people from the University of Toronto, from the University of Sydney to get to learn about how to design a low GI nutrition education. And then what importantly, we contextualized it to Malaysia. So we had dietitians from Malaysia who helped us contextualize it. And we came up with a lot of educational material, including SMSs and emails that we could send to help people do that. So let me show you the results where we able to keep the GI low throughout the 1 year period. So here in the blue, you see the control group, and in the red, you see the low GI group. Throughout the 1 year period, you will see that they were on the intermediate GI. So here is something I want to point out as well. Usually people use the food GI as the diet GI classification. That is considered not so correct because diets are made up of more than just carbohydrate foods. So diet GI of less than 45 is considered low. Between 45 to 60 is considered intermediate, and above 60 is considered high. So throughout the year period, the control group was on high GI, and the low GI group, we maintained them in the intermediate GI through the group. So let's see what happened in terms of their body weight. To make it very easy for you, I have put these tick marks to show you which are the groups that are low GI. So on your left side, you see 6 months, which is the easy time for most people to lose weight. Like as Prof. Anthony Leeds was saying, it's the management that's difficult. So during the weight loss period, more women in the group that received the low GI education were able to achieve clinically significant weight loss of say 5%. And you will see that nobody in the control group was able to achieve a 10% weight loss. At 1 year, you would see that more people who received the low GI intervention were once again able to achieve and maintain clinically significant weight loss of 5%, 7%, and 10%. And once again, you will notice that nobody in the control group was able to achieve a 10% weight loss. So this benefit was also translated in terms of fasting blood sugar, their dyslipidemia, and we did not see any metabolic disadvantage in the whole 1 year period. So safety is something that's very important for us as well. So the other important thing that we learned was mean GL was a very significant predictor of weight loss in this group of women, high risk group of women, which means carbohydrate quantity is important as well, but the carbohydrate quality is important as well. And the other thing that we saw is low GI nutrition education can improve dietary fiber intake, something that most of you, I guess, in practice are trying hard to get the fiber up in the Malaysian population. So here is one other way to do it. So now that we know it works, and it works for Malaysia, so now we have to come up with strategies to put the GI into practice. So we are working here at IMU to put to research into strategies which help us put GI into practice. And one of it is to building the local GI database, which is a very big undertaking. And the other one is looking at food innovations where we can lower existing diets GI. So when it comes to the GI databases, we had created this back then when we wanted to do the RCT, where we have taken all the list of the foods in the Malaysian food composition tables and matched them to Malaysian GI values or those which are closely associated. But definitely there is a need for more GI values. And recently with my colleague, Dr. Harvinder Kaur, with A-Star under Prof. Henry's leadership, we have come up with the Glycemic Index Compendium of non-Western foods. 940 Asian foods. Mind you, we've gone through each of these values and we have made sure that the methods that was used adheres to the ISO or the FAO methodology. So these values that you are seeing here are pretty good. So for those of you in practice, this is a very, very good reference for you. This is the most updated Asian food values for GI. So next, I'm going to talk to you about how can we innovate to lower postprandial glycemia. Prof. Leeds, who spoke before me, spoke very nicely about the scientific mechanisms through which foods can lower GI. And here we are looking at three different things. One is the food choice, which means I choose a lower GI option. Second one is I choose to prepare in a way that lowers its GI. And finally, I choose to eat it in a way that lowers the GI. And scientifically, what's the basis behind it is because they can affect two of the most important rate limiting steps. One is how quickly the food enters the small intestine, and the other one is how quickly it enters the glucose enters your blood system. So in the same paper, if you see, you would see suggestions for how to choose smart, how to cook smart, and how to eat smart. When we say how to choose smart, could you use parboiled or basmati rice is what you hear from most people, but I will show you some of the things that we do in Malaysia as well. Cooking smart is when they ask you to use something like vinegar or something like ginger and cinnamon in cooking, which can help you. Like he spoke about polyphenols earlier, things like that, which can lower the postprandial glycemia. Eating smart is not consuming the carbohydrates by themselves, but using other things like fat and protein to go along with it. The healthy plate is one good model for us to follow as well. So even when you want to choose a low GI food, when is the best time to choose it? Which meal? And here is the answers that comes from the Malaysia's own population. So here's something very, very interesting. So the blue bars that you're seeing here are people who have been fed a low GI breakfast. The same people come for the lunch, they take either a low GI meal or they take a high GI meal. So the ones in the red bars that you are seeing here are the ones who consumed a high GI breakfast. So here's something that's very intuitive: low GI breakfast and low GI lunch. Of course, your postprandial glycemic response at lunch is quite low. Then what happens when you have a high GI breakfast and a high GI lunch? Of course, it is higher. But that's not interesting. The interesting one is this group of people who had low GI breakfast, but then they took a high GI meal, just like these people. These were the same people. They are the same people, but this is a crossover design. But you can see that when you have a low GI breakfast, your postprandial glycemic response is lower. Therefore, the breakfast is a very important meal for us to consider the glycemic index. So the next one is about cooking smart. So we spoke about vinegar and all of that, but we had a group of dietetic students who were so intuitive. They said that won't work for our population, so we will come up with something that's more acceptable for our population. And they tried the same thing with lime juice. So they added either 2 teaspoons or 1 teaspoon of lime juice to tuna sandwiches, and they looked at what happened to the postprandial glycemia. And they were able to show that even this small change that they could effect reduce the postprandial glycemia at 30 minutes and 45 minutes, which I thought was pretty amazing. And then we have Dr. Chingley, who's going to speak after me, who looked at how meal sequence can affect lower glycemic response, whether it can lower glycemic response. This is a very interesting study. So people were either, it was a cross-sectional study design, so you have the same people doing this as well. So first they either consume a carbohydrate food or a protein food, and then they would also consume a composite meal. Then they would rest for a few minutes. And then those who consume the carbohydrate first would then consume the protein. The composite meal would finish the second half of their meal. So it was also standardized for the amount. And the ones who consume the protein first would then eat the carbohydrate. The protein here was a chicken dish. And the carbohydrate, as you see, is white rice. And here I'm showing you the results. So this was done in both normal weight and overweight participants. So I would like to bring your notice to this black things that you see here, the ones who consumed the protein first, then waited, and then had the carbohydrates seem to have the lowest glycemic response, irrespective of whether they were normal weight or overweight. So you could tell me it's very difficult for me to eat my protein, then wait for 10 minutes looking at my rice and then eat it. So maybe that's not for you, but I would like to then ask you to look at this composite meal, which is the dotted line that you see here. And you would see that if you had a composite meal, something that's very similar to what the Malaysian healthy eating plate says, you can still control your glycemic response rather than having the plate filled with carbohydrates itself. So that's a good learning as well. So apart from this, we have some experimental work where we try to work on how to lower the GI of specific foods and snacks. And QA is something that's very, very important to us. So we are also looking for some alternatives, some low GI alternatives to sucrose. And one of the sugars that really caught our interest is Isomoltullus, which, as you see, has the same monomers as sucrose, glucose, and fructose, but the bonding is different. So when the body metabolizes Isomoltullus, it hydrolyzes it much slowly, and therefore it's a low glycemic sugar. For those of you who are in practice, you will be able to see the name of Isomoltullus in children growing up formulas, health supplements, in weight loss supplements, and also in sports nutrition, because it's a slow release carbohydrate, but it is completely digested and pretty safe. We have checked the same in our Malaysian environment as well. We have had our postgraduate students and our undergraduate students who have looked at the glycemic index. We have confirmed the glycemic index in the Malaysian subjects. We have also looked at the safety of up to 75 grams of Isomoltullus, and we are pretty happy to say that it works really, really well. So it works, and our students have taken up this job, and they have looked at a couple of different deserts where they have tried to see if Isomoltullus can replace sucrose, at least in part or completely. I'm showing you a few of these experiments. Not all of them were positive. Some of them were, like for example, the egg custard pudding. They were able to come up with a very good product. And it was also, we did the sensory testing, and it was also well accepted by the panel of subjects who were testing it. Similarly, Kue Bingka Ubi went very well, but Kue Talam Pandan was a total failure when it came to the taste. So we are working on these small things as well. So with that, I would like to end my talk, and here are my summary points. Glycemic index is very, very important, and it can help optimize the postprandial glycemia for Asians. But here is the caveat. Our diet should otherwise be healthy. So you're looking at the portion control first and glycemic index next to further refine your diets. Secondly, definitely we need to build a local GI database because we need to know the GI of the foods that we have. And finally, there are very simple strategies that you can put to practice to lower the glycemic index of Malaysian diets. And the mantra I would say is choose smart, cook smart, and eat smart. And with that, I would like to thank all my students, all my collaborators, and IMU for their generous internal grants, which makes all of this possible. And I would also like to thank all my external collaborators. And thank you all for your patient listening. That's it from me. I transfer it back to you, Prof. Vinny.
Right. So thank you very much, Dr. Sangeeta, for very nicely showing what we have done in IMU and with your research team as well, and some practical tips about it. I can see already some questions coming regarding that, so we'll handle that later. I pass it now over to Dr. Lee. So Ching Lee is going to have a case study approach to see how do we now translate all of that to our patients. Over to you, Ching Lee.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Vinny. So I'll be ending this whole session with a case study approach. And over the next, hopefully 15 minutes or so, what I'll do is we will explore the use of glycemic index in diabetes nutrition management through a case study. And I've organized the case study so that perhaps we can answer 3 questions that you see on screen. So let's just go to the case study. Now, this case study is based on the real patient. Okay, it's a 45-year-old Chinese woman who was recently diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So now Madam C has no underlying comorbidities. And so one of her motivations is to manage diabetes with lifestyle change because she doesn't want to go on medication. Now that might sound familiar to you because a lot of our patients are like that, right? So at first visit, her weight was about 60 kilograms, and this puts her BMI at the overweight range category, and she presented with elevated fasting and HbA1c levels. In terms of what she eats, she has 3 main meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that gave her about 1,600 calories a day and a total carbohydrate intake of about 241 grams a day. Now, the previous speakers introduced 2 concepts. One was glycemic index, or GI, and the other was glycemic load, or GL, which takes into account the carbohydrate content of the meal as well. So when I looked at this patient's diet, all meals were of high glycemic load. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner were of high glycemic load. So then for this case, the 2 questions that we want to answer would be, when do we incorporate the use of glycemic index? Would it be at first visit, second visit, or never at all? And before we actually talk about glycemic index, what are the patient factors that we should consider? So in most nutritional guidelines, I would say all nutrition guidelines for diabetes, the keystone management for postprandial glycemia, right, is to reduce overall intake of carbohydrates within a healthy diet, right? And then when glycemic index is introduced, the use of GI must be in tandem with a healthy eating plan. Now, these are all agreed by the various guidelines across the world. And healthy eating is very important, especially for Malaysians, because in general, Malaysians do not follow a healthy diet. I think you do not need data to show, research data to prove this, because if you look around you, Malaysians love eating. But in general, our National Health and Morbidity Survey that was done in 2019 showed that the majority of Malaysians don't eat a healthy diet. And for patients living with type 2 diabetes, independent studies done in the state of Penang in Malaysia and also Selangor shows that, you know, our patients do not follow a healthy diet. So then when we treat patients at the clinic, effectiveness of our therapy is something that is important. But when we look at data, there is no ideal diet. There is no one diet that is ideal for diabetes management. And when you again look at literature, you will realize that it is individualization of our assessment of the guidance that we give that supports effectiveness. So what do I mean by individualization? Individualization in this context means aligning our treatment to treatment goals, right? And the person's personal preferences and also the patient's ability and willingness to make lifestyle changes, right? I apologize if my face looks a bit dark. My light ring seemed to have just delighted itself. So while we say this on paper, it's easy. In actual practice, it's actually a little bit more complicated because you know what, human eating behavior is very complex. Many factors at different levels will affect the food choices we make and also how we behave around food. So what can we do as clinicians? I think at the clinic level, we can look at the intra-person and interperson factors and look at how our treatment is aligned to the patient's personal preference, the patient's willingness to make lifestyle changes, and also the patient's ability to make lifestyle changes. And when we talk about ability to make lifestyle change, we sometimes link that back to someone's health literacy. And local data is shows quite a bad picture. Only one in every 3 Malaysian adults have low health literacy. And we have also done work among patients who attended a primary care clinic in Seremban to look at how much of knowledge they have with regards to diabetes in terms of physical activity, diabetes-related complications, nutritional management, and glucose monitoring. And we totaled up the sum score of the quiz they took, and only 3.6% of these patients were categorized as having good knowledge of diabetes. And when we actually ask questions on nutritional management, less than half of the patients could identify carbohydrate-rich food. Now that's the first step, right? If you want to manage carbohydrate intake in your diet, right? A third could only identify a high-fat food, and less than a third could identify ways to manage hypoglycemia, the effect of fruit juice on blood glucose, and only 23% could identify what we call carbohydrate-free food, food that doesn't immediately impact your glucose levels. So moving back to the case study, the screen shows the patient's usual dietary intake for a day. Now, if we look at the energy intake, the patient at first visit consumed about 1,600 calories a day with 241 grams of carbohydrate, which approximates to about 58% of energy intake. Now, if you want to assess your patient's glycemic index, then the first thing you need to do is to consider the glycemic index of the individual food and drink items. And then you may stop here, or you may move on a step further to consider the glycemic load of the meal. So what does this meal do to the patient's postprandial blood glucose when he or she eats all of this in combination? When you consider the glycemic index of the several food or drink items, there are several food databases that contain the glycemic index value. And I think Dr. Sangeeta has already told you, there's a compendium of 940 Asian foods that's available. So you can use that. And if you don't want to go through 940 foods, you can just get your hands on the Malaysian Medical Nutrition Therapy guidelines for the management of type 2 diabetes Malaysia, type 2 diabetes mellitus that was published in 2013, and you'll find a list of the GI foods in Appendix 7. So then after you've done that, then you go on to consider the glycemic load of the meal, right? Because postprandial glycemic response after a meal doesn't only depend on the glycemic index of a food, but also on the amount of carbohydrate eaten. So in this respect, we then calculate the GL of the meal, or glycemic load of the meal, by considering both the glycemic index of the meal and also the available carbs in the whole meal. So what does this mean? Let's take a look at lunch, all right? So in this patient, for lunch, the patient had a piece of sponge cake, 3-in-1 coffee, 2 packets, and a large banana. Right, so to calculate the glycemic load of the meal, you actually need three information about the meal: the glycemic index value of the specific meals, which you can get from the databases, its carbohydrate content, and also the fiber content. Now, using all three of this information, then we can then move on to calculate the glycemic index of the meal, which depends on the specific glycemic index of the food and the proportion of carbohydrates that the food contributes. So for example, sponge cake has a glycemic index of 61 and contributes about 23.2 grams of carbohydrates to the whole meal, which is about 30%, right? So then the relative glycemic index of sponge cake would be 61 times 30%, 18.3. So you do that calculation. Then after that, you also take a look at whether the carbohydrates that the patient eats is readily converted to sugar. Now, not all carbohydrates are readily converted to sugar. Fiber is one such example here, right? So we identify the available carbohydrates by deducting the amount of fiber from total carbohydrates. So you get your available carbohydrates. And then finally, you can then use the GI of the meal and the available carbohydrates to then help you approximate the glycemic load of the meal. Now, some of you might be thinking, this is rather complicated. That's true. So if you don't want to do this at practice, if you just want to look at the glycemic index value of the specific foods and you want to stop there, that is also fine. All right. So for this case study, we can appreciate that all three meals are of high glycemic load, right? And dinner has a food item that is high in glycemic index. In addition, the patient also presents with excessive carbohydrate intake, right? And overall unhealthy patterns. So you see a lot of processed foods here, not enough vegetables and things like that. Then we look at the patient-related factors that can actually affect eating behavior. At first visit, the factors that affected the patient's eating behavior would be highest level of education at secondary school level, a busy lifestyle, so food must be convenient, and the eating out pattern, plus her motivation of wanting to manage diabetes without medications, and also her baseline knowledge. So when I had a conversation with this patient, I rated the patient's nutrition knowledge on diabetes as poor to average, right? Now, for the audience for the audience today who are not familiar with the type of food that is served in kopitiam, I've shared a photo from my own personal collection, and this is just a plate of kway teow, so flat rice noodles, and it's a standard portion that I took. I had for lunch, I think last year. Now, 90 grams of carbohydrates come from the noodles alone. So a lot of Malaysians who eat out have meals with a very large carbohydrate base to it, right? So for this case study, I decided to just give basic nutrition education, mainly because I didn't want to overload the patient with too much information at first visit. So then I educated the patient on the role of carbohydrates and healthy eating to manage diabetes. Then we worked on helping her recognize the types of food that contain carbohydrate. And then we used the very simple plate portion method as a visual cue to help her eat smaller portions of carbohydrate for better post-meal glucose control. All right, so moving on, 3 months later, the patient comes back, and we see that her weight doesn't really change, but you know what? Her fasting blood glucose level and HbA1c has come down slightly, and this may be because the patient has reduced her total carbohydrates intake. But then her glucose targets are still not very ideal. So this is where we know from research that perhaps introducing the concept of glycemic index can help this patient further lower down her blood sugars. So how then can we hold a conversation about this? Now, the wrongest thing to do is to tell your patients to go and look at the GI databases. Okay, very extensive GI databases are good for clinicians or for practitioners, but for patients, reviewing the whole long list of the food items can sometimes leave them overwhelmed, right? They can't find the practical solution. Plus, when you actually look at the GI, right, values of the food, it varies within a category, right? So what you see here is the GI values of rice, right? And we know from the previous speakers that many factors affect glycemic index. So this may not be practical. So perhaps a more practical solution then would be to just talk in generalities about a food's glycemic impact instead of just its specific GI or GL values, okay? So the American Diabetes Association recommends that we teach patients to recognize foods in 3 categories. Category 1, low glycemic impact, then category 2, medium glycemic impact, and then the third category, high glycemic index. And then after that, go on and tell them to choose most often from the low glycemic impact category, and also choose less often from the high glycemic impact food categories. Right? Do we have Malaysian databases for this? Yes, we do. It's in a table form, and you can get your hands on a copy of the Medical Nutrition Therapy Guidelines for Type 2 Diabetes mellitus. It comes in this table. And also the Clinical Practice Guidelines for the Management of Type 2 Diabetes. It also has another table, right? Then if your patient wants to know a little bit more about glycemic index, it might be helpful to talk about a general guidance surrounding the use of glycemic index. And these are 5 helpful education pointers that patients seem to relate very well to. Getting them to eat more fruits and vegetables, that's quite common, right? Getting them to increase soluble fiber in their diet, teaching them to complement high GI food with low GI food. So for example, if you were to eat white rice, then you complement that with a lean protein or some vegetables, or some dal. Choosing food that is least processed. So here, the less processed, it may not be totally accurate, but I tell my patients, the less processed the food is, the slower it gets digested. That's what I tell them. And if the patient is willing to use blood glucose monitoring to analyze individual response to that specific food. Okay, so moving back to the case study, at the second visit, the patient said, she's very positive about the changes she's made, but she finds it difficult to find healthy food choices when eating out. Okay, so she needs guidance on problem-solving skills. Her weight loss is slower than expected, which tells me that perhaps there are some days in the week, she may not be very adherent to the diet, she's better glycemic control, but not at target. Okay, so if you look at her dietary intake, she has reduced overall carbohydrate intake from first visit, and that is good, right? She is now eating instant oats for breakfast. It's a good source of fiber, and it's good, but because it's instant and she microwaves it in the microwave with just water, right? The glycemic index remains high. Her food choices for dinner, for lunch as well, is high in GI. But overall, the patient is starting to eat a healthier meal pattern. Okay, so what I did was, before even going to education, I did some counseling with the patient. And this is because, remember, the patient was saying it's getting a little bit difficult to eat afterwards, right? So I affirmed her positive eating behaviors, and then I used motivational interviewing to extract intrinsic motivation by revisiting her reasons for change. She doesn't want to start medication. Then we move on to nutrition education, and this is where we started having that food conversation about glycemic index. Now, a lot of Malaysian patients are familiar with slow release medications. You know, metformin is one of it. And so I use this concept to teach patients about glycemic index. I say they're slow release carbs, and they seem to understand this concept. So for breakfast, we discussed several options. For example, instead of using instant oats, let's now move on to either rolled oats, or the patient did talk about this whole grain oat muesli that she saw in the supermarket that she shops at. We talked about preparing oats with milk instead of just plain water. And then we also discussed having overnight soaked oats, because research shows that overnight soaked oats actually have maintains its low glycemic index when you compare that to, say, cooking oats hot. Right, and moving on to dinner, we say perhaps you can either switch from white rice to whole grain rice. Okay, if she wants to, she can buy a long grain rice. And then I reinforce the plate portion method for composite meals. So never ever just eat just carbohydrates alone or starchy stuff alone, you know, like what she used to in the first visit, just plain noodles for breakfast. And then we closed off with some counseling where we discussed practical solutions to address lack of healthy food choices when she eats out. And we talked about bringing brown rice from home for lunch at work. Okay, so what happened to the patient? At a 6-month follow-up at the 3rd visit, you can see that she has lost weight, so she was very happy, and her glycemic values went down to target, 6.3 millimoles in her fasting blood glucose and 5.9% HbA1c. And as a dietitian, what was most interesting for me was that she could maintain a low-calorie diet 6 months after I saw her, and she could maintain a reduction in carbohydrates 6 months after I saw her. That's good adherence. And now she can start to incorporate, low to medium GI food into her diet. Okay, so we come to the last slide of my session. So in summary, there are 3 points here. Firstly, when we do talk about GI, we do it once an appropriate amount of carbohydrate intake has been established, and then we use glycemic index as part of a healthy eating plan. Now, the second point to note is that we need to align the intervention we give to treatment goals and patient factors such as personal preference, individual willingness to make the change, and also ability to make the dietary change. And finally, when we do talk to our patients about GI, okay, forget talking about GI values and glycemic load values. It gets a bit confusing. We can consider talking about the food's glycemic impact, right? And also provide general guidance that supports healthy eating. And if your patient is willing to do go for blood glucose monitoring, or even better, self-monitoring of blood glucose. With that, thank you very much. And I think I pass the session back to Prof. Winnie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. I think that was a very nice, and congratulations, you did so well with your patient. It's so good that the patient could actually get the A1C into target.
That's right.
By just using, healthy diets as well as glycemic index and load.
Yes.
Okay, so we now come to the question and answer, the forum now. So if we can have all our speakers to switch on their microphones and also their mic and their videos. Okay, thanks, Prof. Anthony. Dr. Sangeeta is here. Prof. Chan, unfortunately, cannot join us because she has a patient that she needs to attend to at the hospital. But I'm sure Dr. Leeds will be able to cover any medical questions that we may get. So now let's take a look at the questions now. I think I will start with the most important, the basic thing, which is about the cutoff points for glycemic index. And I think this is something that a lot of us practitioners also wonder, because if you're just 1 point above or 1 point down, you move from low to high. moderate to high. So perhaps Dr. Leeds would be the best one to take this, and we can have comments from the others. So Dr. Leeds, does the cutoff point for GI classification change? How do we really interpret it? Because different studies, I think they may use different reference wood, but maybe your comment about the cutoff points.
Yeah. There was a comment, as you saw in the question and answer early on, about the reference foods, and I noted that in fact experimentally people had either used white bread or glucose, and that on some of the databases, particularly if you look at the current large one from Australia, you get figures for both of those, so by reference to both bread and to glucose. With regard to the thresholds, these are arbitrary, and I think it's like any figure that we look at about a feature of food. If you go back the steps looking through how the results were derived, all the food scientists will tell you is that these are really, in almost all cases, an arbitrary value, which is a sort of middle of a range of values that you get. If you analyze any variable in any food, you get a range of values. The one you put in is the sort of most common, or the middle of the range value. And so it's probably not appropriate to be totally obsessional about worrying that, oh, this diet calculates as being just 1 or 2 values above a threshold. The critical thing is where it's moving overall. So what I would say is not to be too obsessional about specific values, but take everything as a whole. Bear in mind that these are estimates really, rather than absolute scientifically hard values. Because you've got to remember how this is done. And you've all done these studies where you take a panel of subjects and give them individual values vary, and you're taking the average value for the group. And if you take several different panels of 15 or 20 people, do the same thing, you'll get slightly different results. And because it's a physiological assessment. And so I think one mustn't be too strict in the interpretation.
Yeah, that's right.
That would be my answer.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Leeds. Maybe Dr. Sangeeta can have some comments, because I see here also there are some questions about how does glycemic load is being calculated. So maybe Jingli can also weigh in here. And also there's something about how do we lower GIs in food. So maybe Dr. Sangeeta, in terms of methodology, that people are using different references. And also I realized that in Malaysia, you may see watermelon being high GI in one database, and in another database is moderate or even low GI. I've seen that before. So maybe you can explain what's going on there.
Yeah, that's very, very pertinent question. And especially when we started working in the area of GI a decade ago, that was the biggest problem. So one of the most important things is the methodology. So which is one of the things that I alluded to as to why researchers and practitioners, not the public yet, which go to the GI compendium, is because you want to make sure that you are adhering to the ISO methodology or the FAO methodology, because anybody can do glycemic index testing with the glucometer, but then your covariates are definitely there. So that's one important thing, Prof. Vinny. And the second thing is the reference could either be glucose or white bread. But when they use the white bread, they use a conversion factor. So in fact, the GI is not affected by which reference food that you use. So if you use the white bread, you will multiply it by 0.7. So there is no problem in using either. But in our own studies in IMU here, we found that for Asians, it is better to use white bread as a reference because our variability with glucose is much higher than Caucasians. So that's something that we have found as well.
Okay, yeah, so that's great. So now I'm going to take on some questions that talks about how do we lower the GI. So Dr. Leeds, I think in Malaysia, there's a lot of interest. I mean, there's a lot of interest in rice, and I see several questions here related to rice. I like to take this question, it's quite interesting, that talks about de-starched rice. There's a general belief that if you wash your rice, often, you wash it and you see all the white color that's on the rice, the water, and you throw that away, you're actually de-starching the starch away, right? And that therefore is healthier. Or even de-sugared or de-starched rice cooker. So that's the other one. I've got lots of patients who ask me, there's this special rice cooker that apparently lowers carbohydrate content with cooking. So our listener would like to know what's the mechanism behind this, and is it really significant?
Well, with regard to just simple washing, I'd have thought probably not making a great effect, but I'm sure, Sangeetha, somebody must have done some experimental
We should
work.
try.
I would imagine that that doesn't have very much of an effect. Why would you want to destarch anyway? Why don't you just reduce the portion size, or choose a different variety of rice?
Yes, that's right. So possibly if we have patients who are asking about these rice cookers, I guess, Jingli, what would you say?
I was going to unmute myself. I think it's in the clinic, right? Like you can see so many factors affect the GI value of the food. So when my patient comes up, I have patients who come up to me and ask, if I buy this rice cooker and use it, it promises to destarch it, and will it work? I say in principle, it may, but what we need to do is check whether it works for you or not, because it depends on your rice that you use, how long you cook it. There's so many other factors. So usually I bring in self-monitoring of blood glucose, and that works perfectly. So I teach my patients SMPG, individualize it, and if it works for them, good enough. It doesn't work, then they get angry at the rice pot seller.
Yeah. But I guess the most important point, which is also in the CPG, is total carbohydrate first.
That's right.
So it doesn't mean that if it's low GI, you can have 2-3 platefuls of it. I think that basic principle is still there, regardless of what cooking pot you use, right?
Correct.
Sangeetha, there's one more question here about shorter cooking time of rice reduces the GI. Could you explain that?
Yeah, definitely. I think Prof. Leeds did mention about that. When you have a shorter cooking time, what happens is you do not disrupt the starch that much. So it becomes less available to your pancreatic amylase. So in essence, you are hydrolyzing it much less. So therefore, much less of the glucose enters your bloodstream. Therefore, your postprandial glycemic response and GI is lower.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just the principle, very simple one.
Yeah. And what happens if you add coconut oil?
That's a very interesting question. It comes up in many different conferences. Yes, both Jingli and I, and even I think it was there in Prof. Leeds' presentation as well, consuming carbohydrate by itself is a definite no-no. But then, nutrition is about the field of substitution. So when you add the coconut oil, definitely your postprandial glycemic response is going to be lower, but how much of the coconut oil are you going to use? Is it within your recommended portion? And we all know coconut oil has saturated fatty acids as well. Yeah, so we want to keep it within our recommendations. We do not want to add anything extraneously that's not within the conventional healthy recommendation. So that's one thing that Prof. Vinny, Jingli, and all of us try to keep saying it over and over again. Your healthy recommendation guidelines, they apply. The second layer is your GI. So yeah, so when you're thinking about coconut oil, it should be within your recommendation, within your fat that you should be consuming.
That's right. And also the type of fat. So coconut oil still stays in the saturated fat area. So I think that's another conversation altogether about how healthy it's coconut oil. Okay, so let's now look at the other question that's coming up. Is you talk about replacement of Isomoltullus in your study, Dr. Sangeetha. And there's a question here, very interesting to note that there's a feasibility to replace sucrose with Isomoltullus. What would be the cost implication? And I think there's somebody from the food service industry asking, is that something practical that they can do?
Very interesting. So one of the reasons that we actually started looking at Isomoltullus is because it was not an artificial sweetener, it was pretty natural in a sense. And the other thing is it was not very expensive. I'm not going to say that it cost the same as sucrose or table sugar. So sucrose is around 3 ringgit per kilogram when we were looking at, and Isomoltullus ranged between 8 to 16. So definitely it is more expensive. But then we also checked about what happens, what is the perception of the Malaysian public. There is a clientele which is looking for low GI options. For them, for those who can afford, this may be a good option to substitute sucrose with Isomoltullus in those snacks that it works. The other thing that we also checked, Prof. Vinny, was the fact that we knew that this was going to be extremely expensive. So we also tried using Isomoltullus and sucrose and half to reduce the cost a bit. And that seems to work in certain recipes as well. So this is an area that definitely the food industry can get into.
What about calorie-wise? How much does Isomoltullus have in calories?
That's a very, very interesting question. Isomoltullus is low GI, but it is one of those interesting sugar which is completely digested, which means you will get the same amount of calories from isomoltullus as you would from sucrose.
Okay,
That's
so
very
as I think as dietitians, as diabetes educator and physician, we have to look at the total diet, not just one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so coming back to perhaps Dr. Leeds now, there's quite a few questions here asking, is glycemic index, glycemic load only for diabetes, or is it also recommended for the general population?
Well, it's interesting. I think from what I can see, the formal guidelines for the management, for example, secondary management of cardiovascular disease, don't actually really refer to this very strongly at all, despite the fact there is quite a body of evidence. But in some ways that doesn't surprise me, because those guidelines also don't refer terribly strongly to weight management either, despite the fact that we've actually run some really rather large clinical trials or feasibility trials. So it's one of those areas where a little bit disappointing in the sense that there is evidence, and I mentioned earlier on work done at Imperial College about 15 to 20 years ago, which showed that in people who did not have diabetes, that you would get improvement in the cardiometabolic risk factors. So the evidence is there. Maybe a little bit more work does need to be done, but I think it's one of those examples of where we're tending to ignore the evidence that is there. It's often the case, isn't it, where some work, very good work, it goes into the literature, nobody takes any notice, and then 15 or 20 or 25 years later, somebody comes back and realizes that actually somebody's already done it, and it's all there, but nobody took any notice, and nobody incorporated it into guidelines. So my guess would be that we ought to be doing two things, as you know what I think anyway, that we should be much more serious about achieving weight loss, we should be much more serious about achieving weight maintenance, we should be much more serious about managing through non-pharmacological methods, both the cardiovascular risk factors, but also blood pressure. We know that weight has a big impact on blood pressure. All of these things sort of interact. And this is what we need to do, but actually getting that translated into a method that really works in practice is the real challenge. We're all challenged by that, and everybody's trying to find solutions.
Yes.
So the answer, I think there is good evidence there in the literature, but it's been ignored. I don't know whether Qingli and Sangeeth would agree with that from their reading of what is there.
Yeah, so I think most of us would agree with you that glycemic index, glycemic load, I think in the context of Malaysians, you can see from Prof. Chan's data, we're looking at 2 out of 5 of us are overweight obese, 1 out of 5 of us have diabetes. We've got all the comorbidities of either hypertension or lipids. I'm increasingly seeing younger patients with hyperlipidemia in my clinic. I think all of us have to follow a healthy diet. I think it doesn't matter. And prevention is still the way to go. So yes, Dr. Leeds, I think those data that we tend to ignore because we over-focus it on diabetes, even the part about weight maintenance, you're right. I have a lot of patients who lose weight and then the weight comes up. So how do we now look at weight maintenance? Needs to be further, perhaps it's something that we can have another webinar on. And the preview study that you showed is really interesting because obviously focusing on glycemic index does help with weight maintenance. And it is something that's perhaps acceptable. I have a very important question here that I would like to also get the views of the panel. And that is about socioeconomy, because currently now Malaysia is facing some challenges with our ringgit weakening, and a lot of our patients are from low socioeconomic background, low education background. How do you educate them about glycemic index, right? What they eat is your regular stuff that you buy on the streets, you know, fried noodles, nasi lemak for breakfast. So what are the good choices, and what can they do to prepare to, you know, minimize the impact or the load of unhealthy diets? And what about taste in the elderly? So thank you very much for someone who answered this question, which is very practical because that's what most of us see in our patients. So maybe comments from the panel, maybe Sangeeta and Qingli first on the Malaysian context, and maybe Dr. Leeds. Do you face the same issues in the UK? How do you manage that? Yep. Anyone?
Yeah, can I contribute from
Sure, please do.
Practice perspective? I think I think cost of food is something we have to think about. When I do talk about, say, slow release carbohydrates foods, and so the Cost is on the patient's mind because they often associate, low GI foods with more expense. And that's because they're used to seeing packaged, say, rice or bread. It says low GI or lower GI, and then it's more pricey. So for patients who may not be able to afford it, we don't have to go that road. Remember the data on composite meals and not eating carbohydrates alone. I think that one advice work very much with our patients, because if you look at our patients' breakfast patterns, especially breakfast, you go out and what do you have? Your economy noodles, or porridge. It's just very starch based. It has no other additional nutrient components in there besides carbohydrates. So if they were to just balance that out, with other food groups, right, that would already lower the glycemic load of the breakfast meal. So that works, right? And then they could go for cheaper alternatives for protein, like dal. Dal is a good choice of protein. It's got lots of fiber, right? And that would complement the rice as well. Yeah.
I guess, yeah, Dr. Sangeeta. Thank you, Jingli.
That's very, very appropriate, Jingli. Prof. Winnie, we've been trying to model out the price of diets in Malaysia. So one thing that we've been looking at is what average Malaysian usually eats and what's there in the Malaysian dietary guideline and versus the Lancet Eat and so on and so forth. And when the pandemic came, we stopped because everything went down. So what we found was healthy dietary guideline is also expensive compared to what the Malaysian normally eats. So healthy diets around the world are expensive. So this is something that we need to do some advocacy about and get healthy food affordable to the population. So there are no two words about that. So yeah,
that's right. So it needs to be multi-pronged, and I think the food environment needs to change as well. Dr. Leeds, what about in the UK? Do you see this as well, and what do you do?
Well, in the United Kingdom, as you know, there's a proportion of the population who really do struggle to feed themselves and their families properly. And it is, I'm afraid, the case that a lot of people are dependent on going to food banks to obtain free food. And so I think we have to be realistic that being given guidance on a healthy diet under these circumstances is really not the top priority for the individual. I think also it was shown a long time ago, decades ago, that as far as changing diet for a long-term benefit, so if you're talking about a dietary change to achieve a reduced reduction of going forward towards diabetes or cardiovascular disease, that's not an individual's top priority. For most individuals, it's keeping a roof over their head, keeping a job, feeding their children, the stresses and strains of daily life of getting everything done and getting children to school and back and feeding them and so on, supersede any consideration about healthy lifestyle in terms of what the outcome might be in 5 or 10 years' time. Having said that, I think that government could, if it chose to do so, intervene in various ways. Food subsidy and food taxation are options for manipulating availability of foods and the patterns of behavior. In the United Kingdom, we haven't used those very much at all, partly because we've been within the European Union up until just over a year ago. And we are now free to change that legislation. There's not much appetite, I have to say, for differential taxation, and there's not much appetite for food subsidy, but that may well change when we get to the point in 10 or 15 years' time when we have a very high proportion of the population. I think the most recent figure I saw from the World Cancer Research Fund was the UK obesity rate will be 36% in adults in just 5 or 10 years' time. And then, of course, we have the diabetes rates rising behind that. When things get bad enough, something will be done. It's rather a tragedy that with all the information we have, that action isn't taken until the tragedy is right in front of you.
Yes.
We know from, for example, other countries have used taxation and subsidy. The other thing I wanted to comment on was the ability to cook. And, because people buy food, as you know, in the UK, I'm sure, and in many other countries in the world, probably Malaysia, there's more eating out than there was, say, 50 years ago. In fact, in the UK, people hardly ate out at all 50 or 60 years ago. And that means that the abilities that were passed on generation to generation in terms of how to run a family's buying of food, cooking of food, presentation of food has been lost. And so one of the things that is happening on a, I think, quite an extensive scale is we have classes for children for teaching them about food and how to cook. A lot of these in a lot of schools, so that looks good for the future. Adults are also brought into classes as well, should they choose to come. And so there's a recognition that there is this lack of continuation of that knowledge about how to cook. And of course, people from backgrounds where there wasn't a great excess of money and resources would have learned over the years which foods are the less expensive ones, how to cook and process them. And some of that knowledge has been lost.
Yep.
And that needs to come back into
Absolutely,
pool of
yes. And I
knowledge.
think we can learn a lot from our Eastern countries, like in Japan and Korea, where they focus a lot on the school meals at, where they bring in the farmers, they teach the young students about to appreciate food and so on. And they have one of the lowest childhood obesity rate in the region, actually. So you've got a very good point there, Dr. Leeds. So I hope our colleagues who are nutritionists out there, this is something that we can push for as a, to push more into having nutritionists in schools that we have been talking about for a while. I think just to close off on this issue is, if you're looking at kuih, fried mee, and nasi lemak, my take on this would be take the nasi lemak, do it in small portions, because that's probably the most balanced, and it's probably got lower GI and can moderate that GI, and then avoid the fried mee and the kuih tiao. So that's probably the best that we can advise our patients on. I'm very conscious of time. We've got 5 minutes more, but I see here that there's a general trend on questions that are more related to the use of proteins and the use of stevia, for example. So maybe general comments about the use of artificial sweeteners. Is there any impact on health? And finally, there is a question about the use of protein powders. I think just now we heard Dr. Jenkins as well, talking about how protein would help with lowering glycemic index. So maybe some comments about the use of high protein powders. And finally, a very popular question, what happens with the keto diet? Is that something that we should be recommending? So maybe we start with the use of artificial sweeteners. Just a short comment from anyone.
Maybe I will say something, Prof. Winnie.
Yeah.
We have some things that are in the area of emerging evidence. Probably this is one of those areas. So one of the things that people have said over the time is some of the artificial sweeteners could alter the gut microbiota through which they can affect. But we must see that many of these studies are also coming from the animals, and sometimes translating studies which come from the animals into humans is a bit overstretched, and we realize that. So this is an emerging area that we need to watch the space. We don't have very clear evidence yet at this point.
Yeah. So in other words, substituting it, but don't overdo it.
We don't overdo it.
Yes, that's right. And anything about protein then, the use of protein to lower glycemic index? Here there's someone asking about protein powders, Dr. Leeds.
With regard to the use of protein powders, I'm not sure in
Yes.
relation to glycemic index, but with regard to the composition of foods, then there are protein starch complexes within foods which seem to be important. And obviously, you've already commented on the importance of consuming composite meals rather than just carbohydrate meals. With regard to protein powders, obviously there's experimental evidence, mostly I think from sports science departments and studies on younger people, where you look at the pattern of protein intake and the clear evidence that if you give a pulse of protein of 25 to 30 grams of high quality protein about 20 minutes or so after an exercise session, you get a better response in muscle in terms of retention of lean mass if you're on a weight losing program or something like that. So there is a place for protein powders if you're trying to increase lean mass or maintain it during weight loss. It's not actually used very much in real clinical practice as far as I can see. And with regard to keto diets, while there is experimental evidence for those in relation to weight loss, they have not yet, the evidence has not yet been taken account of in guidelines because the evidence is not yet strong enough, I think. And obviously there are some downsides to use of keto diets as well. So that's a sort of remains an open question, but we really, in all cases, really have to wait until the body of evidence is sufficient that there's a sort of consensus, and then the ideas move into guidelines, which takes about 5 years longer than it should do normally. But with regard to protein, I do think that we've tended to ignore one of the interesting things, both with regard to fat and protein, is that we tend to ignore the importance of the pattern of intake throughout the day and the metabolic effects. And I think with protein, it's about time we started to consider the timing of protein in relation to exercise. And one of the interesting areas, and David commented on this in relation to older people, I think if you look at the pattern of who do we study when we study adults? We tend to study adults in the age range 18 to 60. We don't actually have these studies on 60 to 90-year-old people, largely. Obviously, there is much more work on now in relation to sarcopenia and older people, but we really need to start doing our standard studies on older people, because that's going to be a third, 40%, getting on 45% of the population in 10, 15, 20 years time. And we need to know how they respond. And we need to know how to use physical activity in relation to the pattern of protein intake for that group, I think, for the future. That's an area that needs to be worked on. Probably, well, it is being worked on, but we need to know where we stand in the future.
Yep, thank you so much, Dr. Leeds.
Can I just
yes,
something
please.
about protein? Because when this discussion is going on, I just thought about the work that we did on meal sequence, where we fed the participants with chicken breast that we fried it with turmeric, put some capsicum in, and then followed by white rice. And we saw, eating protein first had a great lowering effect on postprandial glucose. And when you look at, again, it's not at the clinic level yet, it's not practice level yet, but in research, they are starting to hypothesize that perhaps it's the amino acids that interact with your gut hormones, right? And so they release certain gut hormones that actually help your body lower postprandial glucose. So there could be a role, of just loading with some protein first,
Yes, I think there's a lot of studies now showing protein and vegetable first, carbohydrate last. Okay, so I guess we've had great discussion, very good talks. Very good participation for almost, I think right now, even at 5 o'clock, there's still 160 of people who stayed around. So any last comments from everyone, then I think we will wrap up. So maybe I start to invite Dr. Leeds first. Your final words about this glycemic index diet and body weight.
Yes, I think my main statement would be that glycemic index and glycemic load do matter. I think it's important. It clearly should be applied more extensively in helping out people with diabetes. But I think that we should actually put more effort into working out how to prevent diabetes, and therefore more effort there into managing body weight, all things that we know actually can prevent diabetes from the big diabetes prevention trials, but also looking at using low GI, low GL diets as part of the maintenance program for those people to maintain them in a state which leads them to being less likely to develop diabetes. Maybe we need more studies. Nobody's going to repeat the previous study. That was hugely expensive, involved hundreds of people managing over 2,000 individuals to begin with. So that's already been done, but perhaps some smaller studies.
Thank you, Dr. Leeds. For information, we will be discussing the preview diet. Jenny Brand-Miller will be speaking at the Malaysian Dietitians Conference coming up. Ching Lee, your summary?
My summary is there's no harm. You can use glycemic index, the concept in practice, but never forget to always reinforce the concept of healthy eating. I think sometimes when we manage patients with diabetes, we may be very just glucose-centric, all we want to bring is just the sugars down. Then we forget that people with diabetes have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. We forget that we've got to protect their kidneys, and then now they're linking diabetes to gut health. We forget about the other organs of the body. So healthy eating may sound boring, but actually it's key, it's base. So make sure our patients understand that concept first, then move on from there.
Very well said, Ching Lee. And finally, Sangeeta, from all your work, what's your take-home point?
I think I would like to echo what Prof. Leeds said. We know GI works. We know there are problems with GI. So our job is to find out what we can refine about it. The concept that it does work in Asians, Malaysians as well. So we need some work that goes into building the local GI database. So we definitely need some work there. And we should also have some translational work that can actually translate GI into practice that practitioners like Ching Lee can actually use in their practice to optimize the diets of their patients. That's it from me.
You're right. So with that, I thank all the speakers and I thank Prof. Chan as well. And she apologizes she can't be here to finish off with this. Look forward to more CTNH webinars coming soon. I think we're planning one again sometime in the next 3 months or so, and we'll still focus on areas related to diabetes prevention or even diabetes remission. I see very nice comments from the audience. Thank you so much for spending your Saturday with me. Before we end, don't forget to give us your feedback because that's how we improve. And with that, I wish you a very good weekend and stay safe. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you. please do scan the QR code there and give us your feedback. Thank you so much for joining with us.